Greetings, everybody. My name is Ada Hatcher, and I will be presenting to you my individual creativity project today. What we're going to focus on is what it means to make and drink a damn fine cup of coffee. So I began this summer project thinking that I was going to do an exploration around learning how to draw. It's something I've always had some insecurities around and thought I was never really very good at it. So I thought this might be a good opportunity to get over some insecurities. And the idea was just surrounded by a lot of angst, and I wasn't really that excited about it. And I knew that I really wanted to have fun with this project. That was a big goal of mine. And I had already had some summer plans to experiment with coffee recipes. And so I decided to use that for this project. So the first thing I was thinking about was why coffee? Why do I want to explore what it means to make a good cup of coffee? And I realized that I've had this ongoing desire, probably for a couple of decades, to have a perfected recipe that I use to make a cup of coffee. I'm not exactly sure where the origin of this lies. I just know that it's something that I've had for a long time. I know that one inspiration that I did have was, or have had, was Agent Cooper from the television series Twin Peaks. He's this real quirky, oddball character who goes to solve a murder in this very quirky, oddball town in Washington, I think. And so he was always going to have cups of coffee in various places. He'd have coffee at the local cafe. People would serve him coffee, and he would always smell it before he would take a sip. And often he would proclaim, "Now this is a damn fine cup of coffee." That was one of his ongoing lines. And I always just thought that was really charming and kind of funny. So I was thinking about the smells and texture of coffee, the current methods that I currently use to make coffee. So I've just always loved the smell of coffee. And there was a time I didn't like the taste of it, but I just love the smell. And the texture of the grounds varies from very, very fine to, medium to heavy ground. So different types of coffee and the different grounds and textures make for a different kind of cup. My current methods are kind of like a medium to fine ground. I use a French press, which makes a nice, good dark cup of coffee. And I really like it because it's a get up and go kind of cup, which is often the way that I drink coffee, is making it fairly quickly. But I also like it to be really bold, never sweet, in the morning at least. And then I like my coffee very, very dark, very rich, very bold, and unsweetened. But I also like it very creamy. So my biggest goal, I think, when I make a cup is that rich smell. How do we get the taste to match? Which I think it's a hard thing to achieve. A lot of times I smell coffee being made and then I have the cup and it just doesn't quite match up. So that's always been a big focus of mine. And I feel like I have that process down pretty well, and make pretty good cups of coffee every day. So going into this, the beginning of the process was to try and recreate the Cafe Cubano experience, which was an experience with that I had when I was lived in New Orleans, with a cup of Cuban coffee. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that was, and a little bit later in the presentation. Then I was identifying our current collection of coffee making apparatuses, and knew that I wanted to try out this recipe. And then I also had a sub question, which I've had ongoing, I think throughout the year. What do I do when there is no cream or milk? This is a big thing for me in the morning because I do not drink black coffee. And so every once in a while we run out of fresh cream or milk, and I'm just never quite sure what to do and haven't been that excited about the current choices of dehydrated products. So in the preparation, I revisited this experience of a most memorable cup that I drank when I lived in New Orleans. It was in 2005. It was probably the summer before Hurricane Katrina hit. I was still living down there and had this cup of very rich, dark, and sweet coffee. I had a Cuban friend there, and it was a afternoon, and we were just hanging out and chatting. And part of the Cuban culture is drinking coffee and socializing with others. And so he had made this incredibly rich cup of coffee. I knew that he had used this brand Cafe Bustelo, which you can find in any supermarket, and it's really cheap, kind of the same price as maybe a can of Folgers, and it's pre-ground. So it was just incredible to me that you could make a cup of espresso that was that dark, that rich, with a cheaper kind of coffee. I think we often associate high quality coffee with really high quality beans and a specialized process, and pricey beans. So there were several things about that that really stood out to me, and that it was just this amazing cup, and a lot of care went into it, and there was a feeling of ritual around it. And what also came up for me were some negative feelings, just because that time period of my life, I was going through a lot, and Hurricane Katrina came in right after that, and I had just moved away from New Orleans. And so recreating this experience, I was drawing on the uniqueness of partaking in a history of another culture, but also mixed with personal feelings of what was going on with me during that time period, and was all mixed up into this moment. And I think I've had that a lot with my experiences in coffee, in drinking coffee, where um, and I think this might be a cultural thing. I'd have to look into it more, but just that there are these moments that are associated with coffee, and I have a lot of those throughout the years. Some of them are more memorable than others. So that really helped me to reflect on what are those special moments with coffee. So the Cafe Bustelo, like I said, it's inexpensive, it's easy to find, and the unique history behind it is that there was a Spaniard who had moved to Cuba and lived for many years in Cuba, and then relocated to the United States and began this company, Cafe Bustelo, up in New York, I think in the early 1900s. And so, as Cubans came over into the United States, Cafe Bustelo historically here has been the coffee of choice, with using this particular method, which I'm about to explain, and so making the stovetop espresso with the Cafe Bustelo, which not only tapping into Cuban culture. When I had this cup in New Orleans, I was also tapping into the Cuban experience within American culture. So it's very layered. At this point, for my research, I went in search of a Cuban coffee recipe. Cafe Cubano, it's also known as cafecito, is comprised of an espresso shot and what's called espuma. Now, the what of espuma, what is it? It is sugar, and traditionally they use raw sugar cane. In Cuba, use raw sugar cane, and then they would add a little bit of a splash of coffee to it, and then they would just whip it vigorously for a couple minutes with just a fork or a spoon. And so the interesting thing about in Cuba, they didn't have a lot of access to cream and milk, but they had a lot of access to sugar. And so they had perfected this recipe for making espuma, which is what I used in making this recipe. So I gathered my materials. I went out and got a can of Cafe Bustelo. Already had the mocha pot, which is this double cylindrical stovetop espresso maker with the black handle on it over there. My measuring spoons, two glasses here for the espresso, and my sugar. And so, yeah, and of course the sugar. And here's the recipe that I used. I'm not going to, spend time going through every aspect of it. If you would like to uh, copy that, and or you can just look online and find one yourself. There's a lot of really great recipes or variations of recipes on there. But you go through making the espresso with the stovetop mocha pot, and one of the most important things about this recipe is that you serve and you socialize. This is a very social drink for Cubans. The ritual of drinking coffee and socializing is such an important aspect of it, which when I was with my friend in Cuba, or not in Cuba, my Cuban friend in New Orleans, it was this afternoon social experience, like I said, and it just really helps to engage and socialize that you're sharing something in this ritualistic kind of way. My results from my cup of coffee that I created was a damn fine cup of coffee. It was incredibly rich. However, it was really way, way, way too sweet for me in the morning. And I thought if I was going to make this again, it would be great for an after dinner dessert. I got really positive feedback from my husband. We all thought it was super delish. So again, too sweet for me in the morning though. So it's interesting how that's changed. When I had this cup back in New Orleans, I ate a lot of sugar any time of the day. And so back in the day, I could have had that any time of the day. But now it's changed. So then after I realized this is not a way I would drink my coffee in the morning, I decided to alter the recipe and use fresh raw cream from our local farm. So I call this the land of the privileged. In Cuba, they didn't, as I said, didn't have access to the daily cream and dairy products. And so I feel very privileged that we live down the road from a local farm that has really good fresh raw cream for us every week. So I used the same recipe using the mocha pot, and then I just poured the whipped cream into a regular sized cup of coffee, poured the coffee over it, and for this I drank in solitude. For me, my morning cup of coffee is always in solitude because I'm having it by myself. My family is still sleeping, which has its own special associations for me. My results from this were a pretty good cup of coffee, yet it was lacking in the rich and dark quality that I love. I think this would be perfect for lovers of a lighter cup. So my sub-question of what to do when there is no cream or milk, that was answered for me by my good friend and host when we went on a trip to Washington, D.C. Thank you, Chris Whitworth. If you don't have any cream or milk, great. Throw your cup of coffee into a blender along with a dollop of coconut oil and blend. I would never have thought of doing that before. It sounded kind of gross to me, honestly, and I tasted it, and it did have that rich quality. Somehow maybe the bitterness of the coffee combats the intense taste of the coconut oil. So you really don't taste the intensity of the coconut oil. And it adds this kind of rich quality to it that kind of mimics the cream for me. So that was my feedback was yes, a damn fine cup of coffee. However, my husband was not impressed. So that brought me to the question of what is a damn fine cup of coffee anyway? He drinks his a day old and cold and thinks that tastes really good. I do not share that experience with him. So my experience with the Cafe Cubano, like I said, the results were successful in regards to recreating this damn fine cup of coffee. But I did, of course, desire the same strength and thickness without the sugar. So in going through the raw cream experiment, it was successful in regards to taste, but not the thickness, and resulted in a pretty good cup of coffee. And my aha from this part of the exploration was that there is a real subjectivity of personal experience. So it was interesting to relate that that knowledge to this particular experience of coffee drinking. Because I have argued a lot about what makes a good cup of coffee, but to think about it in a subjective way really was illuminating for me.